Between the time when chaos broke Cadia and the return of the sons of the Emperor, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, Kronan, wearer of the jeweled crown of Aquilonia, upon a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell thee of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure.
Story continued from Kronan the Cunning playlist, a new Leagues of Votann units video. And so it was that we rejoin our hero, Kronan the Cunning One, lord of all of Aquilonia, and a fast-engorging empire, of course. And what a pickle he was in, as some might think, for he had Orkies to the left of him, Orkies to the right of him, Orkies before him, and all of them were filthy traitors. This was not all, of course, because that would have meant a simple display of power from Kronan would have almost immediately ended this farce. Yet, this was not the case, for the traitor forces had turned on him right in the middle of a barney of epic proportions. Well, epic may be overbaking the cake a little, as he had only mustered a mere fraction of his Waaargh to engage on this, engagement. And if Kronan were from any other sentient race or species of a non-psychotic nature, he would have been deeply wounded by the set of events. Not to say that being wounded was something that Kronan was not well acquainted with, of course, for was he not the orkiest orc in all of the Waaargh? Potentially the whole of Orkidom. Well, Gazgul notwithstanding. Of course he was. But this was more of the flesh, the form, the substance of the universe. Kronan was a veritable patchwork of wounds and scars, being the truly orc he was. No, this would have referred to the upset one feels when being stabbed in the back, again, metaphorically, as Kronan did indeed know the feeling of getting stabbed in the back as well. Oddly, not very often though, as he was usually right there in the front of any attack on the enemy of the day. And so it was that some of his bosses had turned on him, had connived with the kin, the Squits, who owned the meteoric moon-like facility they were presently assailing. Now some he barely gave a crap about, like Melton John and that moron Bub von Butch, nor was he anything more than nonplussed when he realized that Grinner the Backstabber had been in secret communication with the diminutive warriors they were presently being so rudely interrupted from crumping. But even Kronan would have to admit the sight of Madnut turning on his own kind was a bit of a kick in the rump, really. Well, again, if Kronan had not worked out exactly what was going on with his trusty head weird boy, cunning lad that he was. Hence Kronan knew that he had to take out Madnut pretty swiftly. Then he would be able to tell who was under the mindy-windy powers of Krunkelstein, and who was an ardent, if not entirely enthusiastic, turncoat. What on Aquilonia did the Squits offer to them? What could possibly be worth taking on the Cunning One and his forces? Kronan was well aware that the vast majority of his big bosses were as thick as squiggot dung, so it would all depend on how the situation was presented to them at the time of the bribery. Like a child being offered to accept one sweetie immediately, or a whole bag in mere minutes should they not take the lesser offer. The Cunning One was pretty certain that his big bosses would indeed snaffle the one sweetie, and then attempt to slaughter the holder of said bag of sweeties to get the rest. But was this because they were all nicely fighty these days? Or was it because none of them could hold the concept of the future in their dingy and underdeveloped noggins? This quandary aside, a nuance to be returned to. Well, never actually, as Kronan just didn't give a poop. Yet, in any case, Kronan had been stitched up like a kipper. Or so most would have believed. The Squit overlord, the Kalua, certainly had deemed this to be the case when he attempted to jeer at Kronan only moments before. Alas for the Squit lord, he was now legless and dragging himself about with his arms, as the Cunning One had hacked his legs off, not wanting to waste the treat all in one go, thus showing legendary restraint for a greenskin, and being a true paragon of virtue to his entire Waaargh. Kronan had left the Kin Lord alive, saving him for later. And so it was that the forces of the traitor bosses had ploughed into the rear of Kronan's first attack wave. Colonel Clinker had done this surprisingly well, but may have fallen foul of Melton John and Grinner the Backstabber. And that was not to mean that they had used some form of bird strikes to discombobulate or cripple the Storm Boy boss Clinker. Not that sort of foul, the other sort. As in when you break the rules of a game of some form, usually a sporting endeavour to be honest. Hence, Clinker's wing had fallen to pieces, and Melton John was driving into them from behind. Anywho, the Pound, the latest of the leaders of the Black Legion, had met a rather icky end. At first, Kronan had been mightily impressed with the Pound, as he simply turned around, accepting that he was being attacked by Bub von Butch, and cut his bloody head off. Now that was one twerp that Kronan would not miss, although Kronan did have a soft spot for both of Von Butch's pets. Ever popular Patsy the Amble was always entertaining, and Henrietta, Bub's moustache squig, had been very charismatic. Kronan decided that, at battle's end, he might try to find Henrietta and attempt to coax it into being his new facial hair squig. The last one Kronan had used to adorn his features made him look a total pillock, you see. The hair squig had seemed to dislike shouting, so it shifted from above Kronan's mouth and formed into those horrifically risible sweeping effects into two peaks over Kronan's ears, making him look like an overblown copy of Wolverine. Hence, Kronan had used it as a butt-cleaning squig and thrown it out. Not that this had been the end of the matter, for the squig seemed to detest loud noises, but still held loyalty unto its lord, Kronan. So it crept into his tent at night and reattached itself to the cunning one. On a half-dozen occasions, Kronan had been delayed from morning events while attempting to tear, cut, or even burn off the rebellious yet enamoured facial hair squig. Yet, we do not hear about every last thing that Kronan does, as it is most often very silly. Anywho, back to the Pound. He had turned and identified the nature of the situation, wheeling his armies around and ploughing straight into the centre of the second wave, the traitors. Alas, in a rather ironic manner, Madnut Krunkelstein had burnt the Pound to a crisp, using tidal waves of blue flames. And so it was. The Clinker was missing presumed pâté. The Pound had been frazzled, and the Waaargh was tearing itself apart. Now Kronan, being the cunning lad that he was, had ordered half of his honour guard, his Black Legion, to continue the assault on the Kin defences, while he went back to deal with the rapscallions and wretches that had turned on him. For, let no bones be picked about this one, the timing of the event had been sacrilegious, and none too surly either. The ingrates. Here Kronan was, treating his closest adherents, his big bosses, to a magnificent scrap against a totally unknown enemy. A whole new arena of brawl was on offer, for none in the cunning Waaargh had even so much as heard of the kin of the Leagues of Votann, let alone had the near joygasm of getting to grips with them for the first time. Oh, fighting and winning was the lifeblood of every good Orky orc, but there was also room for new and novel entertainment. And of course, the greatest form of any entertainment was expressed in the form of toe-curlingly violent, violence. That Kronan would share this rare delicacy, a totally new form of enemy, and to then be snubbed by his underbosses? Again, for any other being in any other army of any other species, this could well break the self-image of the leader and his entire army. Thankfully, this was not the case, for Kronan saw this all as quite a rum-do, or something like that. He was encouraged by the situation when the third wave of Orky forces touched down on the surface of the moon of Aquabondi, and these forces had proven to be loyal to the Cunning One. This third force was comprised of the Hog Riders of Higher Wafter and his legendary 4 Knobs, but was also supported by Step-on Squawking, Orbit Eye-Sting, and Hypocrates, another member of the more naval. and they had come up behind the traitors and were thrusting deep into their rears in return. Especially the huge force of Squighog riders, led by the Warhogsmen of the Apocalypse. And they were named Foster Cluck, Cupid Stunt, Potal Trick, and Tucking Fwat. Each had mobs under their banners, and they were considerably, nay noticeably, more cunning than their lord, Hiawatha, on Munchington the Fourth. Yet they were not quite as crumpy nor fighty as Hiawatha, so he nominally remained in charge. The Hogsmen sort of did what Hiawatha said. They took notes, is how they put it, and they then gained the result their boss required for victory. Purely decided by the Hogsmen, of course. But Wafta did really enjoy winning, so he remained unflappable about it, or more to put it, unaware of how or why things went so well, but reaping the accolades at the end. Cluck, Stunt, Trick and Fwat were not just brutal, they were also cunning. Well, a bit. They wouldn't be winning any episodes of Skin That Squiggoth or Die Trying through guile alone. Yet each was right fighty, and knew how to lead their mobs when the war was declared, and they all sped forward into the enemy. With these sub-bosses, backed up by the whopping Munchington the Fourth and Hiawatha, the outer edges of the block of mobs under the direct control of Madnut Krunkelstein were ridden over, and only when Madnut cleft off a segment of Weird Boys to slow them down did they, slow them down. But the losses on both sides were horrific. Nor was Kronan as bereft of support on his side than one might have previously conceived. One might think that Kronan only had one main stooge in his Black Legion, but no. After losing Tragic Violence and Appledon, he had a wish for a more defined set of replacements. Thus, when the Pound came to power, he was saddled with two underbosses of his own, just for this sort of situation. You know, when the useless git had been shot, stamped on, or transformed into a puddle of crap, or, more pertinently, burnt to a crisp. Hence, Kronan had identified these two sorry buggers as the next to step up. Now one was leading his Black Legion into the Little Squid Castle. The other was leading the remaining half of Kronan's Legion from further behind the lines, as Kronan was to the fore today. Anywho, they were both Robo-Knobs. The first backup boss was Edwin Scissorclaws, a rather lithe orky for a knob, yet he had no digits, for he had his hands chopped off to be replaced by two extremely long and pointy power claws. Ridiculous looking, yet he turned out to be extremely stabby and slashy. The other was Crumplestiltchins, who had a penchant for crushing his foes' heads under his robo-legs. If possible, he would do this by screaming his micro-prayer to Gork, being a hearty Waaargh, of course, and then bouncing up and kicking someone across the head with his metal shins. Which also allowed old Crumplestiltchins to raise or lower his body somewhat to look eye to eye with anyone bogging at him. Apart from Kronan, of course. Even this drooling mentalist dared not raise himself to the rank of the cunning one. No hard guessing required as to the why of that decision. Now Kronan had considered removing his legs to check how tall he actually was, but honestly, he couldn't be bothered going through more trials. Stiltchins and Edwin would do as stopgaps, which was incredibly prescient, of course, as the Pound was a set of ash particles now sticking to everyone around, scattered over many miles by the winds of explosions. Stiltchins was in charge of the segment assailing the Squits, the kin. Hence, Kronan was confident that the Legion would keep up the pressure on the wee buggers. Sad to say, this was not the case, as we shall hear soon. But first, to the battle against the traitors, the confrontation with the Walrus, Madnut Krunkelstein. As Kronan advanced, he witnessed the sea of woe before him. His mega-armor knobbed guard marched through it, not really worried about who was in front of them, if truth be told, yet it was nasty. For endless tides of different-coloured balls of eyes and teeth swarmed one another. It was an ocean of tens of thousands of squigs, ripping, tearing, bleeding, crying, smashing and smushing. The sheer brutality made Kronan's heart swell with pride. And there, at the eye of the whirlwind, the very centre of the carnage, two beings of power had met. A mammoth screeching ball of dental fury was unleashed against its foe. Yes, Tiddles, the avatar of teeth, now culled scores of lesser squigs, snots, and some grots as it rampaged towards the banner at the centre of the opposing horde. None could gainsay or stand against the utterly unreasonable level of slaughter he personified. On this day, the entire numbers of Squigdom lowered each time Tiddles bent his legs and rushed into a new rampage. Yet, when he reached the centre of the enemy formation, well, sort of, there was no one there. Now Tiddles was like unto a god of Waaargh, but he was also being backed up, not only by his Squig Tide, but by a mob of orc youths, and directing them all, Happy Len and his shiny new killer can. They guarded the rear of the Avatar of Teeth, though this was a little bit redundant, to be fair, for reasons that you know, gentle listener, but I shall remind thee. Above, hovering well outside leaping range, floated that horror and wretch, the pet of Mad Nut Krunkelstein, Erebus. The weird squig crackled as it unleashed torrents of flames and lightning into the Squig Tide of Tiddles. Huge gouts created carpets, incinerating as many of his own forces as those of Tiddles. And so this went on, and Kronan smirked and left this scallywag to be bested by his pet, Tiddles. Little was Kronan to know that it would be a sort of fulcrum which drew in more carnage as it moved across the battlefield. For Laserbeak and ever-popular Patsy the Amble also came out swinging in this one. Oddly, so too did the Hunger, Grandmouth Tartan's Rippy Fish, but that is a tale for another time. And so it was that Kronan now moved in force towards Madnut's mobs. Now Kronan had indeed been watching the tactical displays sent to him by Dacko von Smashhoven, who flew above the battle, coming down in dive bombing and strafing runs, wherever was required to most assist his lord, Kronan. And he had seen it all. Von Smashhoven knew that Clinker had gone down, but had survived his fall. He was rallying his burner boys and general mobs, attempting to stop the forward and intensely damaging advance of Milton John and his flash kits. The game was afoot on that flank. With the death of Bub von Bush and then de Pound, the other flank was just a huge mess of marauding mobs annihilating anything that moved. To be honest again, all of the Orkies were having a smashing time down there. Dacko was even a little jealous, just this once. Yet he got over it by cutting a few more enemy trucks in half with his Dacker cannons, and happily remembered there is nothing so fast as a Dacker jet. This was his true calling. Kronan was aware of the unremarkable as well, for Grinner the Backstabber had been erratic indeed, at points aggressive, like his encounter with Clinker, but nobody could gain a bead on what direction he was going in, or why. Well, nobody but, of course, the Cunning One. As Kronan led his legion forward, he watched Grinner's forces skirt the Squig War and then duck back into the side, right out of the path of Kronan. The way was clear to get at Madnut and end this. Kronan smirked. That little weasel Grinner was still hedging his bets. He would cleave to whomever came out of this duel alive. Well, thought Kronan, at least he was predictable, which was sort of reassuring, really. Yet, here he was, so much going on, so many groups still loyal, unloading on his position. Madnut Krunkelstein was dishing it out all right, but he was also soaking up so much damage. Kronan was forced to give him a tiny nod of satisfaction. Why? Well, the new toys, the Gargants, had all opened up on this section, with only a few still moving forward. Their mega-weapons firing down on the traitor centre were pattering off the largest, thickest, most wobbly deep blue force field. Eisting and the other bosses of the third wave were concentrating bubble-chucker artillery barrages down onto it as well, and regular dive-bombing Winds of War fighters were mostly pulling up in time to avoid crashing right into the formation, but not all of them, of course. Yet the strafing added even more pressure to the shields of Madnut. Add to this the assault from behind by the Hogsmen of the Apocalypse, The weird boys surrounded Madnut were lit up like thinkmas trees, and every so often one or more of their heads would pop under the pressure of the Waaargh energies they were harnessing. Intermittently, banks of blue flames came from the force field and scorched loyalist mobs left, right and centre. Kronan saw this firsthand now up close, so his suspicions were confirmed. He knew what he had to do, and as we noted before, there were so bloody many weird boys about these days that what he had to do was repulsively violent, and it didn't bother Kronan in the slightest. If any Jots were involved anywhere in the universe, this was not the place for them, as Kronan simply didn't give a single one. Kronan raised his mighty claw into the air, and the Black Legion megadobs fanned out and went into a run. Widening the front as they did, the thousands of mega-armoured Orkies now made the very asteroid shake as they rushed, then ran. Then, upon hearing Kronan's order, they broke out into a full-on charge. The weird boys around Krunkelstein fired out their powers, and scores of huge green feet materialized and stamped down on the oncoming Orkies. Yet, few of them did more than knock the Legion warriors down. Okay, some were hit by powerfully conjured feet of Gork, and were indeed smashed into the ground like eggs being struck by a sledgehammer, exploding good Orky green blood all over the place. But these were very few, and none, even now, dared send their power directly at the Cunning One. That, they all felt, was the job of Madnut Krunkelstein. And of course, he was willing to oblige. Madnut Krunkelstein did not hover or float as Erebus did. He stood leaning on his staff, shaking with the power coursing through his mind and soul. Yet, Kronan noted, the colour was indeed as he had suspected. Blues, hints of red and purple, but the most prevalent was hidden well. It was a rusty yuck colour. It was not glittering green, and Kronan knew. He was not here to slay an enemy. He was not here to destroy a filthy traitor. Kronan was here to save his friend from the clutches of evil. Well, friend was a bit rich, I guess, but Kronan was indeed sort of fond of Madnut, so it was as close as an Orky could get to the state of friendship, he supposed. Yet, let's be honest, it was not so much an act of benevolence or camaraderie, but of ownership. Madnut Krunkelstein was his weird boy. How dare the slack-jawed weedy goddies of the burp plug their tentacles into Madnut's mind? Yet, the blasts coming from all over the battlefield were weakening Madnut, his concentration, as it was, being split between defence and attack. So bollocks, thought Kronan. Time for one big push. Kronan's meganobs charged the lines and engaged the other weird boys. Kronan leapt forward, diving above the flames coming from Madnut's outstretched hand. He landed and rolled, but not directly at Madnut. That would have been ludicrously stupid. For Madnut was shaking again. His eyes rolled back into his head, a fixed grin on his face, while he capered like a total pansy and shot out bolts of lightning now. But Kronan was the Cunning One, so he distracted Madnut by grabbing two weird boys and throwing them at him. And of course, the two erstwhile subordinates of Madnut were vaporized, their skeletons flashing up and their green skin and flesh melting off them when hit by Madnut's bolts. Yet Kronan had performed a ground strike, landing hard and sending a mini avalanche of mud towards Madnut from his side. Madnut had blown away the projectile weird boys, but was knocked sideways and over by the mud. Kronan charged Madnut, keeping his chopper low. He tore up more sod and launched it at Madnut with his power claw, keeping him off balance and unable to see. Madnut had shot out a hand and released another torrent of blue flames, but it was feet off from striking the Cunning One, who then put on a last burst of speed and slapped Madnut across his forehead with the side of his chopper. A massive power axe, some would call it, but Kronan was an orc, so it was still a chopper. Kronan then slid to a stop and dived onto Madnut while his head still rang. Kronan pinned Krunkelstein's right arm to the ground with his power claw and covered Madnut's left side with the side of his chopper. Incapacitated as he was, Madnut did not even scream, as somewhere deep inside he was still loyal. He was a good Orky, really. So he did not even moan too much when Kronan did what was indeed required, as Kronan planted the kiss of exorcism onto Madnut's nose repeatedly. For Mork was with Kronan, and his bond shone with the pure green power of the Waaargh. This was wholly right. The first connection between Kronan's glowing forehead and Madnut's hooter brought out one, then another of the bastards who had inhabited Madnut's mind. After the fifth nutting, Krunkelstein was well and truly cleansed, and unconscious, of course. To be truthful, the fourth nutting had not elicited any further exorcisms, but Kronan had given him another one out of pure concern. Yes, definitely concern. And there, before Kronan, stood the three he had known would come from Madnut's noggin. A red wispy phantasm, it was Red October, worshipper of the juice god. A blue cloud came out as well, with a very familiar bearing. It was Bastor, demon of the bookie bird. And of course, the third one was all in purple, with big ears and handles all over the place. It was the demon of She Who Thrusts, the one who had assailed and mesmerized the entire Waaargh while in transit, until Kronan had deployed the ancient battle technique of the Haka. But none of them were fully physically present. They had merely possessed Madnut. Yet, how had this become possible? And Kronan knew it was something or someone close to Madnut who had betrayed him way before they attempted to betray Kronan. It must be that wretch Erebus. The three phantasms looked right knocked off, but none stood still if Kronan even paced towards them. Quite obviously, Bastor had keyed them all into the fact that Kronan was the prophet of Mork, and he could indeed beat 7 shades out of a warp being if so motivated to do so. Yet, as they were already fading, and certainly no threat to the cunning one any longer, he gave them a look at his middle finger and claw. And the weird boys around Madnut and Kronan were all now coming back to what some might call their senses. Okay, they still shot out huge blasts of green energy, as many of the Black Legion were now in chopper range and were gutting them quite nicely. Kronan did consider calling off his honor guard, but it seemed a bit unfair for them to weather the endless oncoming cycle of fire and not dish out a bit of a whoop at least. So Kronan let them have their head, only calling a slowdown when they had gotten to the 3rd or 4th rank of Weird Boys, which was, needless to say, a tad late for the taste of the Weird Boys, but no manager, ruler or leader can please all of the people all of the time, eh? Back to the true battle, the War of the Squigs. And so it was that the Battle of the Squigs was coming to a head. And who doesn't like good head, eh? Anywho, the battle raged on, and the Avatar of Teeth was in danger. For he was annihilating the forces of Erebus, but could not get a bead on him. The horrid little weird squig was floating too high for Tiddles to get at him. Even the youths who were attached to the squig tide could not get a shot into the nasty little thing. He was nippy and dodged out of the way easily, yet he was more than able to touch Tiddles. Lightning strikes came down one after another, at first splashing over Tiddles' shields, as the 3 weird boys he had absorbed threw up protective shielding. Yet they were not as engorged in potence as Erebus, who was unmistakably harnessing powers beyond that of the Waaargh energies. He was enhanced by dark power and was wearing down Tiddles. The Avatar of Teeth was slowing now, the electricity smashing into him, now crushing his inherent shielding and zapping the squig beneath. And all anyone could do was look on. Dolefully, Happy Len was attempting to direct his youths to form a tower with their own bodies, attempting to get someone high enough to strike at Erebus. But the evil thing just cackled as he let go of a massive bolt, and the entire youth tower was nearly crisped to an orky. They survived, but had all fallen down and were juddering under the wormies of lightning still crackling down their bodies. The blast came down again and again. As Tiddles was struck too often, he went down onto his knees. Then he fell forward, taking another 2 bolts while he panted on the floor. Tiddles, the avatar of teeth, now moaned, and his face crashed into the ground. None could believe it. A wailing came up from every loyal snot and squig around him as they witnessed the avatar of teeth brought low. Endless crying now drowned out the rest of the battle as the squigs let out their lament. Tiddles was defeated. Slowly, Erebus descended, cackling his evil laugh, the belly laugh of victory. Yet there was an unhinged tinge of high-pitched bitch in there. Nobody really needed to state it, but there was something deeply wrong and unorky about this weird squig, and he now came down to crow over the seemingly lifeless form of Tiddles. Like General Zod in the original Superman 2 film. You know, the camp but endlessly satisfying one with Christopher Reeve, whoever that was. Erebus was crowing to the high heavens over his obvious superior. Yet, as Erebus came low enough, his eyes erupted into saucer sizes and threatened to pop out of his body as the avatar of teeth sprang up like lightning. He bounded into the air, and this time Erebus knew he was not getting out of this easily. The horrid Erebus darted about with his hovering powers, yet Tiddles simply teleported to correct his aim and appeared below Erebus time and again, until finally the weird squig sort of accepted his fate and gave a long, doleful look that could only be described as, "Oh fudge." If he had been a snot or grot, he might well have tucked his head between his legs and kissed his arse goodbye. Yet he could not. For squigs are effectively just balls with teeth, eyes, legs, and an anus. There was simply no way to connect his lips with buttocks, or that which lay between. And so it was that Tiddles gave a mighty roar as he engulfed half of Erebus, and then gave him a very special hug with his 20 rows of incisors. In the one chomp, Tiddles had cut the wretched Erebus in half, and went on to gob the rest down in a second snaffle. Oh, there was plenty of chewing. In fact, Tiddles chewed Erebus far more than anything he had ever consumed. He really enjoyed that bit. Alas, this was not the end of the matter, for lines of power now crashed from the mouth of Tiddles and formed up a little way away from where he had landed. There, bursting upwards and outwards, was a new form, a terrible form. It was like if Jabba the Hutt had been fed extra meals for half a century, so bloated and yucky was it. The energies that made up this new form were green, but not a good solid orky green, but some form of mouldy, yucky green. And wormies were all over this new apparition of Erebus. And it continued to grow as well. It sucked up all the poo that had shot out across the ground from all of the dying squigs, snots and grots. It was becoming a Golgothan, a shit demon. The nasty green eyes of Erebus looked down on Tiddles, who now seemed so small as to be almost normal squig size. The elation of the squigs around the avatar of teeth now returned to wailing, and Erebus transformed, then slithered towards Tiddles. But Mork be praised, Tiddles was not alone. For Ducker von Smashoven had kept an eye open and noted the arrival of this detestable pile of Erebus. Hence, the Lord of the Winds of Waaargh dove down towards this new horror. Alas, he had used all of his Darker and bombs in the previous stages of the battle, but he could still do this one thing. As Tiddles looked up at Erebus for the second time in the one day, he witnessed the most hilarious of events. Just as Erebus was looking down on Tiddles and laughing, a Dakar jet burst from the front of what was once its face. Dakar, being a good lad, had performed the sacred head-butt, dive-bombing straight through the head of Erebus. Yet, his propellers were now flattened against the body of his jet, so he was little more than a spear as he came through Erebus and planted his jet right into the ground. Now Ducker was a magnificent pilot, well, for an Orky, but even he was not proof from the occasional bell-end blunder, and he had indeed smashed into the ground before. Hence, he was mostly broken, but still breathing, and slowly chortling away at his act of heroism. He rolled out of the cockpit segment, flopping onto the ground next to the adulating Tiddles. Yet this was still not all. For, as Erebus was obviously buggered, his form now shifted again, not into solid energies, just wobbly lights with strange screaming coming out of it. And all around the huge carcass of Erebus ran from the vision they saw before them. It was simple. Erebus had been a thing of the burp all along, and now he was returning home. Yet, to the shock and horror of all, the light that heralded his leaving engulfed not only the stinky shit beast, but also covered both Tiddles and Ducker von Smashoven. As quickly as it had erupted, the light disappeared, and Tiddles and Ducker were gone. In his killer can, Happy Len sent out word of this nightmare to the Cunning One. Well, in between snot bubble wailing, of course, for Happy Len really did love Tiddles, and was sort of partial to Ducker von Smashoven as well. Kronan felt like he had been struck in the tummy by a gargant. He reeled from the news, yet he could not stop now. He had things to do, to regain control of the battlefield and bring a legendary crumping to the kin. And the heresy was finally declared concluded by Kronan when he received the cam feed from his vidgrots, clearly showing the end of Melton John. When Madnut had fallen, been reclaimed by the Cunning One, Hiawatha and his Waaargh hogsman of the Apocalypse had gone off to hunt down Melton, which they did, of course, and then they surrounded the traitor and used their choppers to skewer him, and Melton John died under the avalanche of endless pricks. The heresy over, Kronan turned his attention to the squits. Yet he was not himself. His loss was too soon, too near. He keened within to go after Tiddles and Ducker immediately. Yet he had to be patient to regain his centre. Alas, Kronan now checked in with his many mobs across Agwapondi. Now everyone knew Kronan's appreciation of the number 3. Hence, he had declared that all communications be configured in this way. Hence, 3-word reports came crashing in on him. And it seemed the kin were not up for a straight fight at all.
Fucking hell.
Fucking hell.
Fucking hell.
Fucking hell.
Yes, it was obvious. The kin were now hiding and punishing the greenskins mightily. They were kin. They were distant, hence far. And it was hell. Because the Orkies could not get to grips or even shoot the little buggers. It was indeed fucking hell for his mobs all across the meteor moon. And Kronan was so put off by recent events that he was not sure what to do. Hence, Kronan took a few minutes out to perform an emergency cogitation. The fight had gone out of the traitor squigs and snots and grots on the side of Erebus, so he had a few score rounded up and brought to him, which was done very expeditiously indeed. Now Kronan had them thrown to him one by one, as he could not access his own proper thinking grots. Hence, he went manual, and wrung the necks of a few of them, ate a couple to raise his spirits, then basked in the screaming of those who were amongst the grots to be thrown to him. The chewing, the screaming. It was perfect, and it happened. Kronan began to think. The issue was the kin. They knew this meteor, this moon. They had endless warrants of tunnels and defences. They could do this for hours, days perhaps. And this would not only be boring, but really annoying for his boys. How to outthink the squits? Kronan had to concentrate. Then he got it. So, the squits would continue running away, would they? After stamping all over a segment of squits, they were likely to pile in like the true warriors they seemed to be. But how to pin some in place, yet entice the others to come out to play? And Kronan had it. Well, he had wild rampaging bollocks fill his mind for a minute there, which was, as we all know, an eternity. The crap ideas would always be the loudest before you got to the good ones. Like the weapon pictors he tried to install in his power claw 2 moons ago. The first thump was always intensely amusing, and really allowed Kronan to work on his overhead smash, but the pictures seemed to stop after the first real thump, no idea why. Or his other idea, the unsnuffler squig, a crossbreed between a mouth squig and a leech squig. It was to be inserted into the schnoz and would suck out all of the mucus. Yet, this was a crap idea, as it was only days later that Kronan discovered the snotty stuff had to be salvaged, permitted to flourish and harden. Otherwise, there were no bogies, and that meant no bogey flicking. And that was an affront to the gods. Hence, Kronan exterminated the unsnuffler crop to the least and the last. Or the attempt to introduce doctrines, or was it dog trims? In any case, Kronan had hoped his new ways would catch on. These distractions, the Whittlekin castles, the Buggins, even the Astartes, oh, they were all glorious to fight, but wherever the Imperium held sway, it was the mini tantrum that they would face in abundance. Hence, Kronan remembered his epiphany on the Orcs of Omen when it was invaded by the fairies, the riddle of the handles. And so it was. The Kronan let it be known that to strike off the handle of the bigger humies would kill them faster. Yet Kronan was well aware that this was quite a high bar to entry. Orcs being aware of handles at all was one thing, you know, the secondary noses they had between their legs. Yet to gain acknowledgement from the mobs of Orkies that these were weak points seemed even more silly than usual, until Kronan declared that it was cunning. You see, the humies only pretended to die if you removed their head. It was the handle that made the deaded most efficiently. Not that you'd want to resort to that sort of thing early on or anything, but every now and again, even the greenskins understood a need of the Waaargh to just get on with it, really. And a rare cohort of Orkies finally got it. But what was far more entertaining was that the Grots understood this immediately. The wretched cowardly weasels were always up for anything that they could use to even the odds, and they all grinned. Within no time, Kronan had a crack legion of sniper grots. He called them the handle flickers. But the most prolific of this grot hardcore were those who would perform the deed in close combat. Using chopper action, they practiced the slicer slide. And this would be where they would slide under the legs of a humie and slice their meat into veg right off. And thus the humies would die fast and loud. And this mob Kronan called the Grossers. But wait a minute, this isn't the wrong segment. This was an excellent idea. So let's go back to another stinker, like the Grot Wrecking Ball. For Kronan had had a truly fervent day or two while in transit. He'd later admit that perhaps he'd gotten a tad pissed on grog, and perhaps this wasn't a divine vision after all. The concept seemed so solid. Orkies knew the more there were, the harder they got. And were not the Grots Orkies as much as the Orkies themselves? Frontier and cowardly at points it was true, but still they were greenskins. Hence, Kronan rounded up 500 Grots and got a really big chain. Like if Mr. T was hit by an enlargement ray and his bling went with him. It was gargantuan. But that, of course, was the whole point. Kronan then forced the Grots down the chain that was connected to the ceiling, and when they got to the lowest link, they were to form a ball. With so many Grots in one place, surely they could not be defeated. And so it was that Kronan himself tugged on a rope connected to the chain and began to swing it. Now to say he did this all by himself would be to admit the other parties. For Step-on Squawking and Albert Eisting had also joined him in this quest for enlightenment, the forging of a collectively new technology for all Orkidom. But both of them had passed out pie-faced after another round of grog shots. So, the cunning one pulled on the chain, and it swung. It was, at its highest point, going to then come down towards a cargo bay reinforced wall. The Grots all screamed as the ball sped through the air, and finally, the results were known. as Kronan was covered in a tidal spray of green blood from across the entire colossal bay. It was highly possible Icing would drown as he was face down in the green goop. When Kronan wiped the inches of offal from his eyes and face, he knew he'd been more blasted than he had thought, as the grots had become a smush against the wall and the rest started dropping to their deaths, the constant drumming of their impact occurring as the grots who weren't slain simply couldn't hold on any more, as the blood had made them all very slippy. So they fell and became bulkhead pizza. The sloshing sound and sensation was enough to make Kronan heave, so he chundered, staggered to the doors, and left. And as the bulkhead doors opened, the blood sloshed out across the entire battleship, the Mork rampant, thus saving Icing from drowning. But this venture was not to be repeated. Yes, it was definitely a drink issue, not divinely inspired, because this was just icky, or something like that. But of course, as he continued with his cogitation, that was when the gold came. Sidebar from the chronicler. Can you lot stop sending me handle pics or big ears vids? It's not funny anymore. You know who you are. End sidebar. And now, time for a swift commercial break. Are you a cunning lad, but can't motivate your boys? Are you a bright bull basher, but can't get to the right place at the right time? Well, fear not, for solutions are here. Write your orky issues in the comments section, and Big-Eared Penny will provide brutal and cunning solutions to your every orky need. But do sign your orky name, so she can do so with aplomb. Satisfaction guaranteed. Right, back to the action. But the truth now swam before Kronan's eyes. If he could get his orkies to consider this a game, a challenge, then they would stay in it, for every good greenskin was competitive. Secondly, he would flood the region where the kin were hiding with whatever was left of the squigs. They were a dime a million anyways. Then he would use his sheeps to scan for power output. The kin would run him a merry chase, but he would not personally play along. Kronan would simply fight his way in one direction, towards the power banks. No power, no lights, defences, auto turrets, lasnets, etc., etc. He would strike where they could not run away, and nail the little bastards to the floor. Yes, this was the way. The Gargants kept firing on the main walks, melting entire mountains of defences in other areas, as Kronan moved like the wind now. Well, more like a casting of cloud kill, really, a fog of death that marched inexorably onwards. And so, Kronan went to the front of his forces and met up with Rumpelstiltskin. Kronan led the Black Legion, but he did not ignore his other boys, using advanced burner boys mobs to absorb firepower, traps, and treachery. And when they got far enough, they burned everything in trenches of corridors, cutting off escape, filling the passages with noxious fumes. Not all the kin had sealed suits, you see, so many would die if they did not come out to fight. Still, Kronan pushed forwards. The reports still came in from the rest of the war. Fucking hell. And so, the war of attrition and endurance continued. Hours passed, but none could stop Kronan's thrust. He had not gotten bored after all. This was a true challenge. And in the command centre of the kin hearth, the robotic strategist ran out of tricks and tactics before the orcs ran out of steam. There was simply nowhere left to run to, nowhere left to relinquish. And at this, the Steeljacks and Berserkers came. Lumbering kin robot warriors, the smallest matching the size and girth of many an orc nob or boss. They hit the orc lines hard. The front ranks of the meganobs fell under the fire, and the second rank died as the squits crashed into the orc lines. Yet Kronan was with them, and of course, Rumpelstiltskins. The cunning one was brutal. He gutted two of these Steeljacks with each swipe of his mighty power claw, carving others in half with his mighty chopper. Stiltskin lived up to his name and crumpled a fair few of his own. The tide turned swiftly, and the shorter berserkers came in. The conflict was bloody but brief. The brave kin took a pair of meganobs or many normal boys for each death of their own, but they were not that many. Yet, nor was Kronan's force any more. After traps, turrets, civil war and attrition, the Orkies were struggling. And lo and behold, Grinner the Backstabber turned the tide in the western tunnels. His magical hat used for attack, not just avoidance, Grinner and his flashgets hunted kin like rats. He secured the entire flank and cut off any retreat to the greater meteor moon. But why? Because that cunning one had told him to do it. When Madnut was bested, Grinner had just stopped. Shooting, fighting, all of it. He went even deeper into avoidance mode, until Melton was finally finished off. Kronan opened up comms with Grinner and sent over images of Melton's death by pricks. And then Kronan gave instructions to turn hunter-killer in the kin tunnels. And Grinner complied immediately. Kronan had never seen him so aggressive. He'd witnessed something of it in the battle against the Buggins in the Orcs of Omen. But this? Grinner, despite all his bullshit, was a servant of Gork. He took heads like a... Okay, I won't say that. But he took a lot of... Wait, no, bad warning. He found and killed many kin indeed. His boys were fighty beyond anyone's dreams. Not up to the standards of the Legion, but bloody good. Enthusiasm being a real motivator, it seemed. And of course, Grinner the Backstabber was buying his own head remaining attached to his neck, and every boss knew it. Not that any of the other traitor forces on the moon were given any kind of mercy. The traitor orcs were culled entirely. Kronan would need a new crop of bikers and flashkits, it seemed. They were all dead. But they had it coming. Thus the kin were hunted and backed into corners and brought down. The kin fought hard, each corridor a new engagement, a constant cost in advancing. But the Legion, with Kronan at its head, was unstoppable. The final segment were all that was left. A mere 80 kin remained, or something like that. Hence, Kronan then came up with a truly wizard idea. He ordered the last kin to be taken alive. Well-ish at least. And he flooded that last holdout with Orky boys. Hundreds died, hundreds. But they did indeed take the kin mostly alive. Kronan picked up the legless Kahlua, the lord of the kin, from the top of the citadel and dragged him to a holding area. Oh, he was dead angry, of course, but he was not dead. Ha! Kronan would talk with him later. Oh, yes, he would. And so it came to the end. The warless heresy of the cunning Waaargh was over. Another attack by the Dark Goddies had been repulsed, but it had been such a colossal event. This one was indeed worthy of legend. Kronan had broken a rebellion, banished a conclave of demons, and broken a kin base over his knee. He was becoming. By Mork and Gork, this was such a fantastic holiday. Yet now, there was something Kronan had to do. Tiddles, Daka von Smashoven. He was going to get them back. Oh yes, he was. Even if it meant marching into the burp. Right into Shumi hell. Coming soon. Story continued in Holy Crap, It's a Trap, or Tussling with Tusker. And please do remember to comment with your problems for Penny. And of course, hit the links in the description for the wonderful lads who have lent their voices to this epic video. They're Orky, don't you know? And they've got a new video out, so go have a shufty. You may well love it. It's green. Happy October to one and all.